Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into a topic that might just make you question everything you thought you knew about the Middle Ages. The curious case of medieval European public bathhouses. Now, before you picture knights in shining armor, clanking around in dusty, unwashed outfits, or peasants caked in centuries of grime, let me paint a different picture. Imagine, if you will, the gentle steam rising, the murmur of voices, the splash of water, maybe even the faint scent of herbs drifting through the air. You step through a doorway, leaving the muddy, bustling streets of a medieval town behind, and suddenly you're in a place dedicated to warmth, cleanliness, and perhaps a surprising amount of social interaction. Forget those grim, grimy dungeons and disease-ridden hovels often depicted in movies. Tonight, we're exploring a side of medieval life that's surprisingly well clean. You might even wonder if you'd prefer a medieval bath to some modern-day spa experiences. Just kidding, probably. You probably won't survive this, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I love seeing how far these bedtime stories travel across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before the Roman legions marched their way across Europe, leaving behind a trail of roads, aqueducts, and, yes, some truly impressive bathing complexes, the concept of communal washing wasn't exactly invented by them. Oh no, dear listener, humans have always had a fascinating, if sometimes peculiar, relationship with water and cleanliness. Think back, way back. You're not in a grand Roman therme yet. You're perhaps a nomadic hunter-gatherer, centuries before anyone even dreamed of a stone-paved road. You've been tracking game all day, dust clinging to your skin, sweat prickling your brow. What's the first thing you look for when you finally stumble upon a clear, flowing stream or a serene lake? A drink, sure, but then a dip, a wash, a momentary escape from the grit of the day. Early human settlements, often clustered near water sources, naturally incorporated these into their daily routines. It wasn't about elaborate plumbing or heated pools. It was about practicality. You'd wash your clothes, clean your cooking utensils, and yes, clean yourself. Imagine a small community, perhaps a dozen or so families, living near a river. The river isn't just a place to fish. It's the communal laundry, the village shower, the bathtub for the entire clan. Children would splash and play, adults would scrub away the grime of manual labor, and perhaps even exchange a bit of gossip. It was a utilitarian act, certainly, but also inherently communal. These weren't bathhouses in any formal sense, but they were the ancestral wellsprings of communal hygiene. Consider the ancient Minoans on Crete, for example. While not exactly public in the way we'll come to understand, their palaces at Naxos show evidence of highly advanced plumbing and sophisticated bathing rooms, some with terracotta bathtubs. These were clearly for the elite, but they demonstrate an understanding of water management and personal hygiene that was far ahead of its time. You can almost picture a Minoan noble, perhaps after a long day of, well, whatever Minoan nobles did, sinking into a cool bath, contemplating the bull-leaping frescoes on the wall. It's a far cry from a medieval muddy ditch, wouldn't you say? Then you had various indigenous cultures around the globe, many of whom developed their own unique bathing traditions. Think of the sweat lodges used by Native American tribes, for instance. These weren't about immersion in water, but rather about purification through intense heat and steam, often with spiritual significance. You'd gather inside a small, enclosed structure, often made of natural materials, and hot stones would be doused with water to create steam. The purpose wasn't just physical cleanliness, though that was a byproduct. It was about spiritual cleansing, about shedding the burdens of the day, about connecting with something larger than oneself. It was a communal ritual, binding the participants together through shared experience. This highlights a crucial point. Hygiene isn't just about dirt. It's often interwoven with culture, spirituality, and social bonding. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for these early communal washings was practical cleanliness or ritual purification. It's a classic chicken and egg scenario, isn't it? Even in early agrarian societies, where daily life was dictated by the rhythm of the seasons and the demands of the soil, the need for a good scrub was never entirely absent. You're working in the fields all day, the sun beating down, dust clinging to your every pore. You come home, exhausted. A simple basin of water, a scrub with some coarse cloth, might be all you have access to, but it's something. And when the opportunity arose for a more thorough wash, perhaps in a nearby stream or a large shared tub, it was probably met with considerable enthusiasm. It wasn't about lavish indulgence. It was about practical relief and a sense of refreshment. Now, imagine an early settlement, not yet a town, but a gathering of huts. There's a central well, perhaps, or a natural spring. This becomes a focal point, not just for drinking water, but for other activities. People would gather there to draw water, to do laundry, to wash themselves and their children. The act of washing, even if basic, became a communal event. It was where news was exchanged, where courtships might begin, where community bonds were forged. It's hard to imagine these interactions happening in total silence, isn't it? There would be chatter, laughter, the rhythmic thump of clothes being beaten clean. This primitive, yet fundamental, human need for cleansing, coupled with the inherent social nature of our species, laid the groundwork for what was to come. You see, while the Romans perfected the grand public bathhouse, the idea of communal washing was already deeply ingrained in the human experience. It wasn't a foreign concept imported by conquerors. It was an evolution of an ancient, universal practice. So, when the Romans did eventually arrive with their marvels of engineering and their dedication to hygiene, they weren't introducing a completely alien concept. Rather, they were taking an existing human tendency and elevating it to an art form, a monument to their own civilization. They were about to build places where you could get so clean, you'd almost forget what dirt looked like. Almost, because even in Rome, someone probably still stepped in something questionable on the way to the baths. Some things never change, do they? And this is a crucial distinction. While the Romans are often credited with the invention of the public bath, what they truly invented was the scale and sophistication of the public bath. They took the basic human urge to get clean and socialize around water, and they turned it into an architectural and social phenomenon. They added heating systems, elaborate marble, exercise yards, libraries, and even snack bars, well, probably, if they were smart. They transformed a simple act into a complex ritual, a daily necessity into a cultural cornerstone. And it's this legacy, this echo of Roman grandeur, that will ripple through the centuries, even when the empire itself crumbles into dust. You'll see how even 1,000 years later, the ghost of Roman plumbing would haunt the dreams of medieval architects. Or, more accurately, probably just medieval peasants wishing they had a warm bath, as the curtain rises on the true grandeur of ancient bathing. You find yourself transported from those humble riverbank washes to the heart of the Roman Empire, a civilization that practically worshipped the act of bathing. This wasn't just about getting clean. It was an obsession, a way of life, an architectural marvel. Imagine standing before the colossal ruins of the baths of Caracalla in Rome today. Even in their decayed state, they whisper tales of unimaginable luxury and scale. You look up at the towering arches, envisioning vast halls, domed ceilings, and the sheer volume of water that once flowed through these immense structures. It's enough to make your modern spa experience feel like a glorified puddle. The Roman thermae, as these public bath complexes were known, were far more than simple places to wash. They were the ultimate multi-purpose community centers, the social media hubs of their day, minus the endless scrolling and questionable viral dances. You'd stroll in, perhaps after a long morning at the forum, or a particularly grueling session of chariot racing fandom. First, you might head to the palestra, an open-air exercise yard. Here, you could wrestle, lift weights, probably not as much as your personal trainer makes you do, or play ball. Picture the scene: oiled bodies, the grunts of exertion, the slap of skin, and the inevitable bragging. It was the Roman equivalent of a bustling gym, complete with all the associated sweat and questionable gym etiquette. After a good workout, you'd move through a series of heated rooms, each designed for a specific purpose. You'd start in the appetitorium, the changing room. Think of it: marble benches, niches for your clothes, and valuables, though theft was apparently a persistent issue, even in these temples of cleanliness. Some things never change, do they? Then, perhaps into the tepidarium, a warm, humid room designed to prepare your body for the greater heat to come. It was a gentle transition, like dipping your toe into a warm bath before plunging into a hot tub. This was also a prime spot for socializing, light conversation, and perhaps a bit of pre-bath gossip. Next, the caldarium, the hot room. This was the steamy heart of the baths, a room often equipped with a large, hot water plunge pool. The heat would be intense, designed to make you sweat profusely, opening your pores and releasing the day's grime. Imagine the thick steam, the echoing sounds of splashing, and the sensation of your skin tingling as the heat permeated your body. You might use a strigil, a curved metal tool, to scrape off sweat, oil, and dirt, a bit like a medieval squeegee for your body. Sounds delightful, right? A truly luxurious experience where you scraped your own sweat off. Living the dream, finally. For the brave, or perhaps just those who really loved a good shock, there was the frigidarium, a cold water plunge pool. Dipping into this after the heat of the caldarium was believed to close the pores and invigorate the body. It was the Roman equivalent of an ice bath, a bracing shock to the system that would leave you feeling refreshed, albeit momentarily breathless. But the baths offered more than just a sequence of hot and cold plunges. They were veritable cultural centers. Many complexes included libraries where you could peruse scrolls after your bath. Imagine drying off while catching up on the latest philosophy, or perhaps the Roman equivalent of a trashy novel. There were often lecture halls for public readings and debates, art galleries showcasing impressive sculptures and mosaics, and even gardens for leisurely strolls. You could get a massage, grab a snack, or even conduct business. Historians still argue whether the Roman baths were primarily hygienic necessities or social institutions. It's probably a bit of both, isn't it? They were so much a part of daily life that you could probably find an argument over grain prices happening next to someone getting a pedicure. The scale of water management required for these baths was staggering. Roman engineers constructed elaborate aqueducts to channel fresh water from distant sources into cities. This water wasn't just for drinking. A significant portion was dedicated to the baths. The sheer volume of water used and then drained away was an engineering marvel, testament to their advanced understanding of hydraulics and sanitation, at least for their time. You'd have a constant flow of fresh water and air, and the dirty water would be channeled out through intricate drainage systems. It was a closed loop of cleanliness, or at least as close as they could get to it back then. Entry to the public baths was remarkably cheap, often just a quadrant, the smallest Roman coin, making them accessible to almost everyone, from the lowliest slave to the wealthiest senator. This affordability was key to their widespread popularity and their role in Roman society. It created a level playing field, at least in the eyes of cleanliness. Imagine bumping into your emperor while scraping sweat off your back. Awkward, but certainly a unique networking opportunity. The emperors and wealthy citizens who funded the construction of these baths weren't just being altruistic. They were gaining significant political capital and public favor. Building a grand new bath complex was a surefire way to secure your legacy and make the populace happy. Women and men often bathed at different times or in separate sections of the bath. While some very early Roman baths might have had mixed bathing, the general trend, particularly as the empire matured, was towards segregation, either by time of day or by dedicated facilities. You wouldn't want any unseemly behavior, would you, though, of course. Wherever people gather, there's always the potential for a bit of mischief. There were even specific bathing outfits, though often quite minimal, and the Roman equivalent of a towel. The sheer ubiquitousness of the baths in Roman life cannot be overstated. From the grand imperial baths in Rome itself to smaller, more modest versions found in every town and military outpost across the empire. They were a cornerstone of daily existence. They represented Roman civilization, its power, its engineering prowess, and its dedication to an ordered, if occasionally indulgent, life. They were a place of health, relaxation, news, gossip, and even business. This intense, almost ritualistic devotion to public bathing permeated every aspect of Roman culture. It shaped their architecture, their social customs, and even their understanding of health. When you think of Rome, you often picture the Colosseum or the Pantheon. But perhaps you should also conjure images of steam-filled rooms, the murmur of conversation, and the splash of water. Because in many ways, the Roman bathhouse was just as central to their identity as any gladiatorial arena. They were places of sensory indulgence, strategic networking, and, surprisingly, a relatively advanced approach to public health. Well, at least until you factor in the occasional lead piping. But let's not dwell on that for now. This incredible legacy of large-scale public hygiene and social interaction, built upon ingenious engineering and a deep-seated cultural preference for communal cleansing, would eventually face its greatest challenge. The very infrastructure that supported these vast bathing complexes was expensive to maintain and reliant on a stable, centralized power structure. When that structure began to fracture, so too did the foundations of this remarkable bathing culture. The grandeur couldn't last forever, and the coming centuries would see a dramatic shift, leaving these magnificent ruins to crumble, becoming eerie testaments to a past obsession. You've just been reveling in the steamy, social splendor of Roman bathhouses, places where cleanliness was next to godliness, and the plumbing was surprisingly sophisticated for its time. Now, brace yourself, because the winds of change are blowing, and they're bringing with them a chill that will eventually sweep away much of that Roman dedication to public hygiene. We're about to witness the slow, painful decline of those magnificent vermi as the Roman Empire itself begins its long, drawn-out fade into history. Imagine the sheer logistical nightmare of maintaining one of those colossal bath complexes. You need a constant supply of fresh water, which means maintaining those vast aqueduct systems, repairing leaks, clearing blockages. You need fuel wood, charcoal to heat the massive furnaces that warmed the water and air. That requires organized labor, secure supply lines, and a stable economy to pay for it all. And you need skilled personnel, plumbers, engineers, furnace tenders, bath attendants. All of this relies on a strong, centralized government with the resources and will to manage such complex infrastructure. But as the Roman Empire began to splinter, buffeted by internal strife, economic woes, and external pressures from migrating peoples, that stability began to erode. You're watching the once mighty aqueducts fall into disrepair, their arches crumbling, their channels choked with debris. The constant maintenance required for these vital arteries of water simply becomes too much. Without a steady flow of clean water, the grand plunge pools become stagnant, the heating systems fail, and the very purpose of the baths is undermined. It's like watching a majestic ship slowly spring leaks and drift off course. Then there's the economic aspect. Those public baths, while cheap for the individual user, were incredibly expensive to build and operate. Who's going to foot the bill when tax revenues dwindle, trade routes are disrupted, and cities become less prosperous? The wealthy patrons, who once vied to outdo each other with lavish new bathhouses, are now more concerned with defending their own dwindling fortunes, or even their very lives. Public works projects, especially ones as grand and resource-intensive as the Thermae, quickly fall down the priority list when barbarians are knocking at the gates, or your neighbors are starving. Think about the atmosphere shift to the very social fabric that made the baths so vibrant begins to fray. People are less likely to gather in large public spaces when there's a pervasive sense of insecurity and uncertainty. The relaxed chatter and intellectual debates give way to a more cautious, insular existence. You're not going to linger in a caldarium when there's a risk of marauders outside the city walls, are you? The shift from a sprawling, confident empire to a patchwork of struggling successor states meant a dramatic decline in the collective resources and the communal spirit necessary to sustain such institutions. It's not an overnight collapse, mind you, it's a slow, agonizing decay. Some baths might continue to operate on a smaller scale, perhaps maintained by local landowners or a resourceful community for a time. But the grand, imperial complexes, those architectural titans we admire today, slowly become ruins, picked apart for building materials, their once bustling halls silent, filled only with echoes and dust. You can almost hear the wind whistling through the empty windows where marble statues once stood. Now, as the focus shifts away from communal public spaces, where does hygiene go? Well, it doesn't disappear entirely, but it certainly becomes a far more private, often less frequent, affair. The emphasis shifts from large-scale public bathing to individual, domestic practices. If you're lucky enough to be a noble, you might have a small, private bathtub in your villa, perhaps even heated by a small brazier. But for the vast majority of the population, personal cleanliness reverts to more rudimentary methods: a basin of cold water, a cloth, and perhaps a bit of soap if you could afford it. You're back to that bucket and sponge routine, but now without the warm water and the gossip. The decline of the baths also coincides with, and is perhaps exacerbated by, changing religious attitudes. With the rise of Christianity, there was a growing emphasis on spiritual purity over bodily cleanliness. While early Christians weren't inherently against bathing, some ascetic strains of thought began to view excessive personal adornment or focus on the body as worldly vanity, even sinful. Frequent public bathing, with its inherent opportunities for mixed gender interaction and perceived hedonism, could be seen with suspicion by certain religious authorities. It wasn't a blanket ban, of course, but it certainly didn't help the cause of the public bathhouse. Historians still argue whether the decline of Roman bathing culture was primarily due to economic collapse, shifting social values, or the influence of Christian asceticism. It's probably a complex interplay of all three, like a perfectly imperfect storm. So, as Rome falls and Europe enters what historians sometimes, though perhaps unfairly, call the Dark Ages, the landscape of hygiene changes dramatically. The vibrant, steaming social hubs are gone, replaced by a more fragmented, localized approach to cleanliness. Towns shrink, trade diminishes, and the sophisticated infrastructure that supported public health on a grand scale simply can't be maintained. You're living in a world where survival is paramount, and a daily hot bath probably feels like an unimaginable luxury, if it even crosses your mind. This period is often unfairly characterized as uniformly dirty and unsanitary, while certainly a far cry from Roman standards. It's important to remember that people still understood the basic principles of washing and cleanliness, even if their methods were less elaborate. They still washed their clothes, cleaned their cooking utensils, and used water when available. But the widespread, accessible, and luxurious public bathing experience of the Roman era becomes a distant memory, a relic of a lost golden age. You might hear whispers of the old times when everyone could go to the baths, but it would sound like a fantastical tale. The knowledge of Roman engineering, particularly in hydraulics, also suffered a severe blow. The intricate systems of pipes, heating, and drainage became forgotten arts, or at least significantly simplified. Future generations would marvel at the Roman ruins, not fully understanding how they once functioned. It was as if an entire technological era had simply evaporated. You can imagine a medieval peasant scratching their head, looking at the remains of an aqueduct, probably thinking, what on earth was that for? So, as we journey further into the medieval period, keep in mind this dramatic shift. The vast public baths, once pillars of Roman society, are now crumbling monuments, silent witnesses to a vanished era of widespread communal hygiene. The emphasis has moved from collective well-being to individual efforts, often hampered by scarcity of resources and changing social priorities. It's a stark contrast to the lively, steaming halls you just experienced. A testament to how quickly civilizations can lose even their most fundamental conveniences when the underlying structures of power and prosperity falter. You're about to enter a world where getting truly, deeply clean might require a lot more effort, a lot more privacy, and a lot less infrastructure. Welcome to the slightly less fragrant side of history. You've just witnessed the grand Roman baths slowly crumble into disuse, leaving behind a less than fragrant legacy. But fear not, dear listener, for even in the so-called Dark Ages, the flame of hygiene wasn't entirely extinguished. It merely found refuge in a surprising, often austere, environment, the medieval monastery. While the bustling public thermae were largely gone, pockets of cleanliness, often linked to spiritual discipline and practical necessity, persisted within the cloistered walls of monastic communities. Imagine yourself as a weary traveler in the early medieval period, perhaps a pilgrim or a merchant, trudging along a muddy track. You've been days, maybe weeks, without a proper wash. The world outside is fragmented, often dangerous, and certainly not set up for your hygienic comfort. Then, in the distance, you spot the sturdy stone walls of a monastery, rising like a beacon of order in a disordered world. You approach, seeking shelter, food, and perhaps, just perhaps, a moment of respite from the pervasive grime. Within these monastic communities, hygiene wasn't about public spectacle or social indulgence. It was about health, spiritual purity, and the practicalities of communal living. Monks and nuns, dedicated to a life of prayer and work, understood that basic cleanliness was essential for preventing the spread of disease within their close-knit communities. An outbreak of illness could decimate a monastery, disrupting their sacred duties and threatening their very existence. So, while you wouldn't find a Roman-style caldarium, you would find a methodical approach to keeping things, if not sparkling, then at least acceptably sanitary. One of the most common features you might encounter in a larger, well-established monastery was the lavatorium. This wasn't a bathhouse, but a washing fountain or trough, typically located in the cloister garth, a central courtyard. Here, monks would wash their hands and faces before meals, adhering to both practical cleanliness and symbolic purification. Imagine the rhythmic splash of water as dozens of hands were rinsed, the low murmur of prayers, and the sense of quiet order. It was a utilitarian spot, yes, but also a place of contemplation, reflecting the Benedictine rule's emphasis on order and devotion. This was their daily ritual, far from the grand Roman plunge pools, but crucial nonetheless. Beyond the lavatorium, some monasteries, particularly those with access to natural springs or streams, developed more sophisticated bathing facilities. These were often simple, perhaps a room with individual wooden tubs or a larger communal basin, but they represented a conscious effort to maintain personal hygiene. They might even have rudimentary heating systems, perhaps of fire heating stones, that warmed the water, a far cry from Roman hypocausts, but effective enough. The focus was on personal cleansing, not a social event. You probably wouldn't find a monk gossiping about the latest papal decree while scrubbing behind his ears, unless, of course, that monk was particularly cheeky. Monasteries were also centers of knowledge and learning, and this extended to medicine and herbalism. The monastic infirmary, where the sick were cared for, would naturally prioritize cleanliness to prevent the spread of ailments. Baths, often infused with medicinal herbs, were sometimes prescribed for therapeutic purposes. You might find a brother skilled in the ancient medical texts, perhaps even those from Roman times, advising on the benefits of warm water for certain afflictions. This preservation of medical knowledge, however piecemeal, was crucial in a period where much ancient learning had been lost. Furthermore, the act of washing was often imbued with spiritual significance. The washing of feet, for instance, a tradition rooted in biblical narratives, was a common practice, especially during certain religious observances. This act, whether for guests or among the community, highlighted humility and service, understood that cleanliness could be a deeply spiritual endeavor. So, while the pursuit of bodily pleasure through bathing was often frowned upon by ascetic branches of Christianity, the necessity of hygienic practices for health and spiritual discipline was widely recognized. The monasteries also played a vital role in preserving basic sanitation practices. They often had carefully managed latrines, sometimes with simple flushing systems linked to a water source. This might sound mundane, but in a world where waste disposal was often haphazard, such organized systems were remarkably advanced. Think of it, a medieval monastery might have better waste management than many towns of the era. It speaks to their commitment to a structured, orderly way of life. One quirky tidbit: some monastic records describe the washing of the brethren on a regular basis, sometimes weekly or fortnightly, though the exact methods varied. This wasn't always a full body immersion, but could involve washing feet, hands, and heads. It was a routine, an expectation, and a small but significant communal act of self-care. It might not have been luxurious, but it was consistent. Historians still argue whether the frequency of monastic bathing was dictated purely by spiritual rule or also by practical concerns of living in close quarters. It's probably a blend, a practical piety, if you will. So, while the grand public bathhouse essentially vanished with the fall of Rome, its spirit, in a much more muted and utilitarian form, found sanctuary in the monasteries. These were not places of hedonism, but of quiet discipline, where was a tool for health, a symbol of humility, and a necessary component of communal living. They kept alive a flicker of the bathing tradition, demonstrating that even in a world often depicted as uniformly grimy, the desire for cleanliness in various forms never truly disappeared. They were the unsung heroes of medieval hygiene, quietly maintaining a semblance of order and cleanliness when the rest of the world seemed to be spiraling into a mess. And from these monastic strongholds, the idea of communal washing, albeit in a different guise, would slowly begin to creep back into the wider world. You've seen the Roman Empire's bathhouses crumble and witnessed how hygiene found a quiet refuge in the monastic cloisters. Now, as the medieval period truly begins to take shape, we shift our gaze from the humble monk to the powerful lord, from the communal lavatorium to the private chambers of castles and manors. Because while public bathing was a rarity for the masses during much of this era, the medieval elite, those who commanded land and loyalty, often maintained their own, albeit often rudimentary, forms of personal cleansing. Imagine yourself entering a grand, though perhaps drafty, medieval castle. The air inside might be smoky from torches and hearths, and the general ambience far from sterile, but nestled within its formidable walls. Often tucked away in a private chamber or tower, you might find something surprisingly dedicated to personal ablution. These weren't the vast open spaces of Roman baths, but rather intimate, functional areas designed for a single lord or lady, or perhaps a select few of their closest retinue. The most common bathing facility for the wealthy medieval noble was likely a simple wooden tub, often lined with linen to prevent splinters, a thoughtful touch, wouldn't you say? This tub would be brought into their private chamber, filled with hot water painstakingly carried from the kitchen or a nearby well, heated over a fire. Imagine the effort involved. Servants constantly hauling buckets, tending fires, ensuring the water was just the right temperature. It wasn't a spontaneous dip. It was an orchestrated event, a minor logistical marvel. You can almost hear the splashing and murmuring, and perhaps the occasional yelp if the water was too hot. These private baths were often accompanied by perfumed oils, scented herbs, and even fine soaps, which were costly commodities. While the Roman obsession with olive oil for cleansing might have faded, the desire for a pleasant scent after a wash certainly remained. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of your fancy bath bombs and artisanal soaps, just without the glitter and the questionable packaging. A lord might choose rosewater, lavender, or even a bit of frankincense to scent his bath, making the experience not just about cleanliness, but about sensory pleasure and status. A quirky tidbit: some medieval texts mention bathing in wine or milk, though this was incredibly rare and likely reserved for the truly extravagant or for specific medicinal purposes. Talk about a vintage soak. Beyond the tub, privacy was key. These bathing chambers might be equipped with screens or curtains to shield the bather from prying eyes, even within their own household. It underscored the increasing emphasis on individual privacy that contrasted sharply with the open, communal nature of Roman bathing. You wouldn't want your nightly rivals or your gossiping servants seeing you in your most vulnerable, sudsy state, would you? Access to water, especially hot water, remained the primary limiting factor. Castles were built for defense, often on high ground, which made water supply a constant challenge. Wells were common, but moving large volumes of water for bathing was always a labor-intensive process. This meant that even for the elite, full-body bathing might not have been a daily ritual. Perhaps once a week, or even less frequently, depending on the season and the availability of resources. Between these full baths, nobles would rely on more localized washing, basins of water for hands and face, wiping down with damp cloths, and changing into clean linen undergarments. This layered approach to cleanliness was far more common than full immersion. Historians still argue whether medieval aristocratic hygiene was genuinely inferior to Roman standards or merely different in its methods and priorities. While the grand public scale was gone, the personal, private efforts were certainly present, if less frequent. It was a matter of practicalities and social custom, not necessarily a total abandonment of the desire to be clean. The medieval nobles' bath, though private, also served a practical purpose beyond mere personal hygiene. It was often integrated into the rituals of hospitality. A distinguished guest arriving at a castle, especially after a long and dusty journey, might be offered a bath as a sign of respect and welcome. Imagine the relief of a weary traveler, covered in road dust and sweat, being offered a warm bath and fresh clothes. It was a gesture of immense generosity and comfort, far more meaningful than simply offering a bed. Beyond the main bath, castle life still involved other forms of basic sanitation. Latrines, often referred to as garderobes, were common features, though their design and effectiveness varied widely. Some were simple chutes leading to a moat or cesspit, while others might have rudimentary flushing mechanisms connected to rainwater collection. They weren't exactly five-star facilities, but they were a conscious effort to manage waste within the confined space of a fortress. So, while the image of the universally dirty medieval person might persist in popular culture, it's a vast oversimplification. For the feudal elite, cleanliness, though perhaps less frequent and certainly less public than in Roman times, was still a valued commodity. It was a luxury afforded by their wealth and status, a quiet affirmation of their elevated position. You might not see them splashing in a grand communal pool, but they certainly knew the invigorating feeling of hot water and soap. And this private, individualized approach to bathing would continue to evolve, laying some groundwork for future shifts in personal hygiene, even as the broader public bath culture remained largely dormant for a time. It's a reminder that even in the toughest of times, people still appreciated a good scrub, perhaps even more so when they were constantly surrounded by mud and horse dung. You've seen the grand Roman baths fade, witnessed monastic pockets of piety-driven, and even peeked into the private, if modest, tubs of medieval lords. Now, as we progress further into the Middle Ages, particularly from the 11th century onwards, something truly fascinating begins to happen. Europe's urban centers, once diminished shadows of their Roman past, start to stir, to grow, to hum, with renewed life. And with this urban renewal comes a surprising resurgence of public bathing. It's not Rome, not yet, but it's a definite step back into shared suds and communal cleansing. Imagine the bustling streets of a medieval town like London, Paris, or Florence in the High Middle Ages. Population numbers are swelling, trade is flourishing, and new crafts and industries are emerging. People are flocking from the countryside, drawn by the promise of work, opportunity, and perhaps a bit of excitement. These towns are vibrant, often chaotic, and certainly not known for their pristine air quality, with more people living in closer proximity. The need for sanitation, however rudimentary, becomes increasingly apparent. And where there's a need, an opportunity often arises. Enter the medieval public bathhouse, or stew as they were sometimes called in England, from the old French esteve, meaning stove or heated room, which makes a lot of sense, right? These weren't the monumental, marble-clad edifices of Rome. Oh no. Think more rustic, more pragmatic, but still undeniably communal. They were often privately owned enterprises, responding directly to the burgeoning demand for a place where ordinary townspeople could get clean. Often for a modest fee, you'd find these bathhouses springing up in the denser parts of town, perhaps near a river or a good well, as reliable water access was still paramount. Imagine a timber-framed building, perhaps unassuming from the outside, but inside, a welcoming warmth and the comforting scent of wood smoke and damp earth. You'd pay your penny or two at the entrance, hand over your clothes, and step into a room filled with wooden tubs. These weren't individual, luxurious affairs like the Lord's private bath. They were often large, communal tubs, perhaps big enough for several people, or smaller ones grouped closely together. The water was heated, usually by a large furnace or oven that warmed a boiler, and then poured into the tubs. It was a laborious process, but the result was a rare luxury for many, a soak in genuinely warm water. This alone would have been a massive draw after a long day of hard labor, haggling in the market, or simply enduring the general grit of medieval urban life. The prospect of a warm bath must have been incredibly appealing. It was an escape, a moment of soothing comfort. These medieval bathhouses weren't just about the tubs though. They often offered other services, making them genuine little oases of well-being. You might find a barber on hand, offering shaves and haircuts. Imagine the scene, the snip of scissors, the slap of a razor, the steam from the baths, making it all a bit hazy. Some might offer a basic massage, or even bloodletting. Yes, that was still considered therapeutic back then. Remember, not all medieval practices were winners. It's like a medieval one-stop shop for self-care. albeit with a few services you'd probably skip today. This was a fascinating social development. Unlike the highly structured and often segregated Roman baths, medieval public baths often catered to a broader mix of people. Though separate facilities or times for men and women became increasingly common, particularly as moral anxieties grew. We'll get to that juicy bit later. But for a time, they were places where townspeople of various trades and social standings could congregate. You might find a merchant rubbing elbows, literally, with a baker, a craftsman, or even a visiting knight. It truly was a melting pot, or perhaps a boiling pot, of urban society. The rising popularity of these bathhouses also speaks to a shifting perception of hygiene. While the extreme asceticism of some early Christian doctrines had viewed excessive bathing with suspicion, the practical realities of urban living meant that a certain level of cleanliness was simply necessary. People didn't want to be constantly covered in grime, and the growing populations made personal hygiene a collective concern. A cleaner populace meant less disease, or at least that was the hope. Historians still argue whether the resurgence of medieval public baths was driven more by practical health needs or by changing social aspirations for comfort and luxury. It's probably a complex blend, isn't it? A cleaner you is a happier you, and also, potentially, a less plague-ridden you. The very existence of these public baths during the High Middle Ages challenges the pervasive myth of a universally dirty and unwashed medieval populace. While hygiene standards were certainly different from modern ones, and far less consistent than in the Roman heyday, the presence of these establishments indicates a demand for and a provision of communal washing facilities. It shows a degree of sophistication and an understanding of personal care that often gets overlooked. So, as towns grew, so did the number of baths. They became integrated into the urban landscape, an expected amenity for a thriving community. They offered a respite from the cold, a chance to cleanse, and a space for social interaction. They might have lacked the marble grandeur of Rome, but they made up for it in accessibility and sheer human connection. It was a step, a crucial step, towards rebuilding a culture of communal hygiene after centuries of decline. And these humble medieval baths were about to become far more than just places to wash. They were on the cusp of becoming vibrant social hubs, centers of community life, and sometimes places of questionable reputation. Get ready for the next plunge, because things are about to get even more interesting. You've just seen the medieval public bathhouses, or stews, make their comeback, springing up in the burgeoning towns of the High Middle Ages. Now, let's peel back the layers, beyond just the act of getting clean, and delve into the fascinating role these establishments played as genuine social hubs and integral parts of daily life. Because in a world without Wi-Fi, television, or even many public gathering spaces beyond the church and the market, the bathhouse often filled a surprisingly wide array of social functions. Imagine yourself stepping into one of these bustling medieval bathhouses. It's not just the splashing of water you hear. It's a vibrant symphony of human interaction. The low hum of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter, perhaps even the sound of a lute being played in a corner. These places were lively, dynamic spaces where the rhythms of daily life unfolded alongside the scrubbing and soaking. You didn't just go to get clean. You went to connect. For many townspeople, the bathhouse was a prime spot for gossip and news exchange. In an era before newspapers or instant messaging, word of mouth was king. While soaking in the warm water, you might catch up on the latest happenings in the town, who was marrying whom, what goods arrived at the market, or the latest pronouncements from the local lord. It was the medieval equivalent of the water cooler, or perhaps the local pub, but with more steam and less ale, though some bathhouses certainly served drinks. We'll get to that. Closing parenthesis. Beyond casual chatter, these baths often served as informal meeting places for business deals. Imagine two merchants, fresh from the market, discussing prices or forging agreements while enjoying a relaxing soak. The warm, communal atmosphere might have even fostered a sense of camaraderie, making negotiations smoother. It's a lot harder to drive a hard bargain when you're both feeling relaxed and perhaps a little vulnerable in your bathing attire, isn't it? Or maybe it made you more cunning. Historians still argue whether medieval bathhouses were primarily places of hygiene or social recreation. It's a classic chicken and egg situation, or perhaps more accurately, a soap and sponge situation. For the working classes, especially those engaged in physically demanding labor, the bathhouse offered a much-needed respite. After a long day hauling goods, working in a workshop, or tilling fields just outside the town walls, a warm bath was a genuine luxury and a balm for aching muscles. It was an accessible form of self-care, a way to unwind and refresh before facing another grueling day. This wasn't just about feeling clean. It was about physical and mental rejuvenation. You'd emerge feeling, if not entirely new, then at least significantly less dusty and considerably more relaxed. The bathhouse also played a role in celebrations and social rituals. It wasn't uncommon for people to visit the baths before a significant event, like a wedding or a feast, as a form of preparation and purification. Imagine a bridal party, perhaps a few days before the big event, enjoying a communal bath, perhaps exchanging jokes and nervous excitement. It added a layer of ritual to life's important moments, making them even more special. And then there's the sheer element of leisure and recreation. In a time with limited entertainment options, a trip to the bathhouse could be an enjoyable outing in itself. It offered warmth, relaxation, and company. Some larger establishments might have even had private rooms for parties or small gatherings, allowing for more intimate social interaction. It's like your local community center, but with added steam and scrubbing brushes. A quirky tidbit: some medieval bathhouses even employed musicians to entertain bathers, adding to the festive atmosphere. Imagine soaking in a tub while a lute player serenades you. Now that's what I call luxury. The very architecture and layout of these bathhouses facilitated this social interaction. While private tubs existed, many baths featured larger, communal pools or numerous smaller tubs clustered together, encouraging conversation and shared experience. You weren't hidden away, you were part of the hubbub. This communal aspect was a direct contrast to the increasing privacy of aristocratic bathing, and reflected the more communal nature of medieval town life. It's important to remember that cleanliness standards were different. The water in a communal tub might be changed periodically, but not necessarily after every single person. The idea was to get less dirty, to feel refreshed, rather than achieve a sterile, hospital-like cleanliness. It was about shared warmth and communal cleansing, a social experience as much as a hygienic one. And this practical approach to shared resources was a hallmark of medieval urban ingenuity. So, the next time you picture medieval towns, don't just imagine grime and hardship. Remember the vibrant, steaming interiors of the public bathhouses, alive with chatter, laughter, and the gentle splash of water. They were not just places to wash. They were vital threads in the social tapestry of medieval urban life, fostering community, facilitating business, and providing much-needed comfort and recreation for people from all walks of life. They remind us that even without modern amenities, people found ways to connect, to relax, and to feel a little bit cleaner in a world that could be, shall we say, a tad dusty. You've just had a delightful soak, metaphorically speaking, in the social vibrancy of medieval public bathhouses. Now, let's pull back the steamy curtain and peek behind the scenes. Because these communal cleansing spots weren't just places of relaxation and gossip. They were often shrewdly run economic engines, bustling businesses that played a significant Role in the medieval urban economy. Running a bathhouse, especially a popular one, could be a surprisingly lucrative venture. Imagine yourself as a medieval entrepreneur, looking to make your fortune in a growing town. What does everyone need? Food, shelter, clothes, and increasingly, a good wash. Unlike a baker or a blacksmith, a bathhouse owner dealt in a perishable, yet endlessly renewable, commodity: warm water and the service of applying it to people. The investment might be considerable for the building and equipment, but the daily overhead, once established, could be managed to yield a healthy profit. The most obvious source of income was the fee for entry. As we touched upon earlier, this was usually a modest sum, designed to be affordable for most townspeople. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a budget gym membership, but for your whole body. This tiered pricing might also exist, with slightly higher fees for longer soaks, access to private tubs, or additional services. This steady stream of small payments, multiplied by dozens or even hundreds of daily patrons, quickly added up. But the medieval bathhouse owner, ever the savvy entrepreneur, rarely stopped at just the basic bath. They were masters of ups and diversification. Remember how we mentioned barbers? Many bathhouses would lease space to a barber surgeon who would offer shaves, haircuts, tooth extractions, and even minor surgical procedures. This created an additional revenue stream for the bathhouse owner, either through rent or a cut of the barber's earnings. It was a symbiotic relationship. The bathhouse brought in the customers, and the barber offered complimentary services. You'd get a clean body and a questionable haircut, all in one convenient location. What a deal! Beyond that, many bathhouses offered other ancillary services. You might be able to purchase soap, though often a very basic, lye-based variety, perfumed oils or herbs for the water, perhaps a new linen tunic to wear after your bath, or even basic toiletries like combs or brushes. These were all potential sources of additional income. Think of it as the gift shop on the way out of a modern spa, only far less aesthetically pleasing than there was the heating. This was the most significant running cost. Furnaces had to be constantly stoked with wood or charcoal. This required a reliable supply chain and skilled laborers to manage the fires. A shrewd bathhouse owner would establish good relationships with local woodcutters or charcoal burners to ensure a steady, affordable supply. The efficiency of the heating system would directly impact profitability. Too much fuel wasted, and your profits evaporate, much like the steam. This was where practical engineering met financial acumen. Water supply was also critical. While some bathhouses might have relied on hand-drawn well water, larger or more prosperous ones would have invested in piping systems, channeling water from a river or spring. This initial investment could be high, but it reduced daily labor costs. Maintaining these systems, however, was an ongoing expense. Historians still argue whether medieval bathhouse owners prioritized profitability over hygiene, or if the two were often seen as mutually reinforcing. It's a tricky balance, isn't it? A dirty bathhouse wouldn't attract customers, but are too expensive. One wouldn't either. The staff needed to run a bathhouse was another significant cost. You'd need furnace tenders, water carriers, attendants to assist bathers, clean the tubs, and manage the entry fees. This provided local employment, contributing to the town's economy in another way. Imagine the bustling behind-the-scenes activity. People constantly moving, tending, cleaning, and preparing for the next wave of customers. It was a small ecosystem of labor and commerce. Some bathhouses, particularly those in larger cities or with less scrupulous owners, might have also offered less savory services. The term stew eventually became synonymous with brothel in some areas, highlighting a blurred line between public bathing and prostitution. This created both a financial opportunity and a moral dilemma. often leading to calls for stricter regulation from church and civic authorities. This dual function, whether overt or covert, certainly added another layer to the economic model, though it often came with social and legal complications. A bathhouse owner might quietly tolerate such activities, or even actively facilitate them for an additional fee. It's a reminder that even in the Middle Ages, some business models were, shall we say, diverse. The success of a bathhouse often depended on its reputation. A clean, well-run establishment with a pleasant atmosphere would attract repeat customers. Word of mouth, just like in your world, was the best form of advertising. Conversely, a dirty, ill-maintained bathhouse would quickly lose its clientele. This put pressure on owners to maintain a certain standard, even as they focused on their bottom line. So, while often overlooked, medieval public bathhouses were significant contributors to urban economies. They provided a valued service, created employment, and generated income for their owners. They were a testament to the entrepreneurial spirit of the Middle Ages, adapting to changing urban needs and turning a basic human necessity into a thriving business. You might not have thought of a medieval bathhouse as a bustling economic enterprise, but in their own steamy way, they absolutely were. You've just toured the economic engine of the medieval bathhouse, a surprisingly robust business venture. Now, let's wade into what was, and often still is, one of the trickiest aspects of communal spaces: gender and space. In medieval European public bathhouses, the question of whether men and women bathed together, separately or at different times, was a constant negotiation, influenced by local custom, religious decree, and the ever-present realities of human nature. Imagine the early days of these burgeoning town baths, perhaps in a less formal, more experimental phase. In some regions, particularly in the earlier High Middle Ages or in more rural areas, there might have been a degree of mixed bathing. Think of it less as a modern co-ed hot tub party and more as a pragmatic approach to limited facilities. Large tub, perhaps, where families or community members might soak together, driven by the sheer novelty and comfort of warm water. It wasn't necessarily a free-for-all, but perhaps a more relaxed approach than you might initially imagine. However, as towns grew and religious institutions gained more influence, the issue of mixed bathing quickly became a significant point of contention. The church, ever vigilant against what it perceived as moral laxity and temptations of the flesh, often viewed mixed-gender bathing with deep suspicion. The very idea of unclothed men and women in close proximity, even if just for the purpose of getting clean, was seen as an open invitation to sin. Sermons would thunder against the indecency of such practices, and moralists would decry the bathhouses as dens of vice. You can almost hear the fiery condemnations, designed to make you feel guilty about wanting a good soak. This moral pressure led to increasing calls for segregation. The most common solution was to establish separate bathing times for men and women. For example, women might bathe in the mornings and men in the afternoons, or vice versa. This allowed the bathhouse to cater to all patrons while attempting to uphold a semblance of moral order. The changing of shifts would have been an interesting logistical dance, with bath attendants ushering out one group and preparing for the next. Imagine the medieval equivalent of ladies' hour at the gym. Another approach was the creation of entirely separate facilities within the same bathhouse, or even distinct bathhouses for each gender. You might enter a complex and be directed to the men's side or the women's side, with different entrances and bathing areas. This was a more costly solution for the bathhouse owner, as it required more space and potentially more staff, but it offered a clearer separation and less opportunity for moral transgression. This was especially prevalent in larger cities where demand could support such dedicated spaces. The degree of separation also varied wildly by region and culture. In some areas, particularly in parts of southern Europe influenced by Roman and Later, Islamic traditions, where public baths were often highly segregated and sometimes even elaborate. Clean women's-only hammams existed. Strict separation was the norm. In Northern Europe, particularly in earlier periods, the rules might have been a bit more flexible, though still under constant scrutiny. This regional variation makes it hard to paint a single, uniform picture of medieval bathing practices. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for segregation was religious morality, social custom, or simply practical management of public spaces. It was likely a complex interplay, like trying to untangle a medieval knot. The social implications of these gender dynamics were profound. For women, a visit to the bathhouse, even if segregated, offered a rare opportunity for social interaction. Outside the home or market, it was a chance to escape the confines of domestic life, share stories, and connect with other women in a relaxed, if sometimes gossipy, environment. It was their own little sanctuary, a place of shared experience. Imagine the medieval equivalent of a girls' spa day, complete with scrubbing and perhaps some discreet chatter about husbands and children. For men, the bathhouse was another arena for male bonding, business, and political discussion, akin to the tavern but with less ale and more steam. It reinforced existing social hierarchies, even as it sometimes blurred them through the shared vulnerability of being unadorned. A quirky tidbit: despite the moralizing, the actual enforcement of segregation could be quite lax, especially in bathhouses that also served as brothels, the infamous stews. Owners might turn a blind eye to illicit activities, or discreetly offer private rooms for mixed-gender encounters, leading to constant battles with civic authorities and the church. This ongoing tension between perceived morality and practical reality, between ideal and actual behavior, is a recurring theme in the history of medieval bath. It's almost as if human beings, despite stern warnings, still found ways to be, well, human. The struggle over gender and space in medieval bathhouses reflects broader societal anxieties about public morality, female modesty, and the control of social spaces. It highlights the constant tension between the desire for cleanliness and comfort and the religious and social norms of the time. While the image of medieval people as universally dirty is a myth, the idea that their bathing habits were free of moral judgment is equally inaccurate. The steam wasn't just about water, it was about societal pressure too. You've just navigated the sometimes murky waters of gender segregation in medieval bathhouses. Now, let's dive into a truly fascinating and often contradictory aspect of these places: their connection to medieval medical views on health and hygiene. Because in a world without germ theory or antibiotics, the understanding of how water, cleanliness, and disease interacted was a complex blend of ancient wisdom, empirical observation, and sometimes outright superstition. Imagine a medieval physician, perhaps trained in a cathedral school or a burgeoning university, pondering the health of a patient. His diagnostic tools are limited, and his understanding of the human body is based on the prevailing theory of the four humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Health was believed to be a state of balance among these humors, and illness resulted from an imbalance. And guess what was often seen as a powerful tool for restoring that balance? You guessed it, water and bathing. Warm baths were frequently prescribed for a variety of ailments. They were thought to help open the pores, allowing noxious humors or bad air to escape the body. If you had a fever, a warm bath might be recommended to encourage sweating and release excess heat. If you were feeling sluggish or had aching joints, a warm soak could stimulate circulation and bring fresh humors to the affected areas. It was a holistic approach, far removed from our modern pill-for-everyall mentality. A quirky tidbit: some medieval medical texts recommended specific herbal infusions for bathwater, chosen not just for scent, but for their supposed medicinal properties, like lavender for calming or chamomile for inflammation. It was like a medieval apothecary in a tub. Beyond simple warmth, the act of bathing itself was seen as vital for removing external filth, which, while not understood in terms of microscopic germs, was intuitively linked to illness. While they didn't know about bacteria, they certainly knew that too much visible dirt wasn't good for you. They observed that people who lived in consistently unsanitary conditions seemed to get sick more often. So, while the theoretical framework was different, the practical outcome, get clean to get healthy, was often surprisingly sound, however. This understanding was often fraught with contradictions. While baths were seen as beneficial, excessive or improper bathing could also be viewed as harmful. Cold baths, for instance, might be recommended for certain robust individuals or for specific conditions, but generally, warm baths were preferred, as cold could close the pores and trap bad humors inside. There was a delicate balance to strike, a precise art to the bath. It wasn't just about splashing around, it was about therapeutic application. Historians still argue whether medieval medical theories about bathing were genuinely effective for health or merely provided a rationalization for a socially desired activity. It's a fascinating debate. Some of the benefits were likely real: improved circulation, stress reduction, and the removal of skin irritants. Other benefits were probably imagined, based on a faulty understanding of internal bodily functions. But the important thing is that people believed in the medical efficacy of bathing. This belief fueled the demand for bathhouses and justified their existence in a society that was otherwise quite wary of bodily indulgence. Consider the role of public bathhouses in treating skin conditions, while not curing infections in a modern sense. The warm water and scrubbing would certainly help cleanse wounds, remove dead skin, and alleviate symptoms of various skin ailments. For someone suffering from persistent rashes or sores, a regular, warm soak would have offered significant relief, even if the underlying cause wasn't understood. The cleanliness of the bathhouses themselves was a constant challenge and a point of anxiety. While the idea was to get clean, the communal nature of the baths also meant they could inadvertently become breeding grounds for disease if not properly maintained. Imagine a busy bathhouse with many patrons and perhaps water that isn't changed as frequently as it should be. The very place designed for health could, ironically, become a vector for illness. This was a particular concern during outbreaks of epidemics, though the mechanisms were, of course, entirely misunderstood. People might intuit that crowding made things worse, but they didn't connect it to invisible pathogens. Medical advice regarding bathing would also vary by season. In winter, warm baths were often recommended to combat the cold and prevent chills. In summer, lighter washes or even cold water might be suggested to cool the body. This seasonal approach further illustrates the nuanced, if sometimes misguided, medical reasoning behind their bathing practices. It was all about maintaining that delicate humoral balance in relation to the environment. So, the medieval public bathhouse wasn't just a leisure spot. It was often viewed as a place of therapy, a rudimentary medical facility where the simple power of warm water was harnessed for the good of the body. According to the medical theories of the day, it shows a profound, if scientifically imperfect, understanding of the connection between cleanliness, comfort, and well-being. And this perception, this belief in the healing power of the bath, was a powerful force in sustaining these establishments, even as moral anxieties swirled around their very existence. You stepped into a medieval bath not just to wash, but perhaps, in the minds of some, to heal. You've explored the economic pulse of medieval bathhouses and even dipped into their fascinating, if flawed, medical theories. Now, prepare yourself, because we're about to wade into the choppy waters where the warm, inviting steam of the bathhouse met the often chilling scrutiny of the church and its ever-present concern with morality. This was a constant battle, a tug-of-war between the undeniable human need for cleanliness and recreation, and the powerful religious institutions that viewed public bathing with deep, enduring suspicion. Imagine a medieval preacher standing in the pulpit, his voice echoing through the nave of a dimly lit church. He rails against the stews, not as places of hygiene, but as dens of iniquity, temptation, and moral decay. For many devout Christians, especially those influenced by ascetic ideals that emphasized spiritual purity through bodily denial, the very act of public bathing was fraught with peril. It represented worldly indulgence, a focus on the flesh rather than the spirit, and a dangerous opportunity for sin. The primary concern, as you might recall from our discussion on gender, was the potential for immorality arising from mixed bathing, or even perceived indecency in segregated facilities. If men and women were bathing in close proximity, even if not explicitly co-ed, the mere possibility of illicit glances, suggestive conversations, or worse, was enough to send shivers down the spine of a pious clergyman. The baths were often grouped with taverns and brothels in the minds of moralists, seen as places where societal norms broke down and temptation flourished. A quirky tidbit: some medieval allegories even depicted the devil lurking in bathhouses, tempting bathers to abandon their virtue. Talk about a steamy inferno. Beyond sexual immorality, the church also worried about vanity and excessive pleasure. The idea of soaking in warm water, perhaps with perfumes and oils, simply for comfort and enjoyment, could be seen as a form of self-indulgence that distracted from spiritual devotion. Why spend time pampering the body when you could be praying, fasting, or contemplating your soul? This ascetic viewpoint, though not universally applied, cast a long shadow over the public bathhouse, making it a target for criticism and attempts at suppression. So how did the church try to exert its influence? It wasn't always a direct ban, at least not initially. Often, it took the form of moral condemnations from the pulpit, encouraging parishioners to avoid such places or to demand stricter segregation. Bishops and local clergy would issue pronouncements, warning against the dangers of the baths. They might pressure civic authorities to enact regulations. It was a war of words, a battle for the hearts and minds and bodies of the faithful. For men, the bathhouse was another arena for male bonding, business, and political discussion, akin to the tavern but with less ale and more steam. It reinforced existing social hierarchies, even as it sometimes blurred them through the shared vulnerability of being unadorned. A quirky tidbit: despite the moralizing, the actual enforcement of segregation could be quite lax, especially in bathhouses that also served as brothels, the infamous stews. Owners might turn a blind eye to illicit activities, or discreetly offer private rooms for mixed-gender encounters, leading to constant battles with civic authorities and the church. This ongoing tension between perceived morality and practical reality, between ideal and actual behavior, is a recurring theme in the history of medieval bathhouses. It's almost as if human beings, despite stern warnings, still found ways to be, well, human. The struggle over gender and space in medieval bathhouses reflects broader societal anxieties about public morality, female modesty, and the control of social spaces. It highlights the constant tension between the desire for cleanliness and comfort and the religious and social norms of the time. While the image of medieval people as universally dirty is a myth, the idea that their bathing habits were free of moral judgment is equally inaccurate. The steam wasn't just about water, it was about societal pressure too. You've just navigated the sometimes murky waters of gender segregation in medieval bathhouses. Now, let's dive into a truly fascinating, and often contradictory, aspect of these places: their connection to medieval medical views on health and hygiene. Because, in a world without germ theory or antibiotics, the understanding of how water, cleanliness, and disease interacted was a complex blend of ancient wisdom, empirical observation, and sometimes outright superstition. Imagine a medieval physician, perhaps trained in a cathedral school or a burgeoning university, pondering the health of a patient. His diagnostic tools are limited, and his understanding of the human body is based on the prevailing theory of the four humours: blood, yellow, bile, black bile, and phlegm. Health was believed to be a state of balance among these humours, and illness resulted from an imbalance. And guess what was often seen as a powerful tool for restoring that balance? You guessed it, water and bathing. Warm baths were frequently prescribed for a variety of ailments. They were thought to help open the pores, allowing noxious humours or bad air to escape the body. If you had a fever, a warm bath might be recommended to encourage sweating and release excess heat. If you were feeling sluggish or had aching joints, a warm soak could stimulate circulation and bring fresh humours to the affected areas. It was a holistic approach, far removed from our modern pill-for-every-ill mentality. A quirky tidbit: some medieval medical texts recommended specific herbal infusions for bathwater, chosen not just for scent, but for their supposed medicinal properties, like lavender for calming or chamomile for inflammation. It was like a medieval apothecary in a tub. Beyond simple warmth, the act of bathing itself was seen as vital for removing external filth, which, while not understood in terms of microscopic germs, was intuitively linked to illness. While they didn't know about bacteria, they certainly knew that too much visible dirt wasn't good for you. They observed that people who lived in consistently unsanitary conditions seemed to get sick more often. So, while the theoretical framework was different, the practical outcome, get clean to get healthy, was often surprisingly sound. However, this understanding was often fraught with contradictions. While baths were seen as beneficial, excessive or improper bathing could also be viewed as harmful. Cold baths, for instance, might be recommended for certain robust individuals or for specific conditions. But generally, warm baths were preferred, as cold could close the pores and trap bad humours inside. There was a delicate balance to strike, a precise art to the bath. It wasn't just about splashing around, it was about therapeutic application. Historians still argue whether medieval medical theories about bathing were genuinely effective for health or merely provided a rationalization for a socially desired activity. It's a fascinating debate. Some of the benefits were likely real: improved circulation, stress reduction, and the removal of skin irritants. Other benefits were probably imagined, based on a faulty understanding of internal bodily functions. But the important thing is that people believed in the medical efficacy of bathing. This belief fueled the demand for bathhouses and justified their existence in a society that was otherwise quite wary of bodily indulgence. Consider the role of public bathhouses in treating skin conditions. While not curing infections in a modern sense, the warm water and scrubbing would certainly help cleanse wounds, remove dead skin, and alleviate symptoms of various skin ailments. For someone suffering from persistent rashes or sores, a regular, warm soak would have offered significant relief, even if the underlying cause wasn't understood. The cleanliness of the bathhouses themselves was a constant challenge and a point of anxiety. While the idea was to get clean, the communal nature of the baths also meant they could inadvertently become breeding grounds for disease if not properly maintained. Imagine a busy bathhouse with many patrons and perhaps water that isn't changed as frequently as it should be. The very place designed for health could, ironically, become a vector for illness. This was a particular concern during outbreaks of epidemics, though the mechanisms were, of course, entirely misunderstood. People might intuit that crowding made things worse, but they didn't connect it to invisible pathogens. Medical advice regarding bathing would also vary by season. In winter, warm baths were often recommended to combat the cold and prevent chills. In summer, lighter washes or even cold water might be suggested to cool the body. This seasonal approach further illustrates the nuanced, sometimes misguided, medical reasoning behind their bathing practices. It was all about maintaining that delicate humoral balance in relation to the environment. So the medieval public bathhouse wasn't just a leisure spot. It was often viewed as a place of therapy, a rudimentary medical facility where the simple power of warm water was harnessed for the good of the body. According to the medical theories of the day, it shows a profound, if scientifically imperfect, understanding of the connection between cleanliness, comfort, and well-being. And this perception, this belief in the healing power of the bath, was a powerful force in sustaining these establishments, even as moral anxieties swirled around their very existence. You stepped into a medieval bath not just to wash, but perhaps, in the minds of some, to heal. You've explored the economic pulse of medieval bathhouses and even dipped into their fascinating, if flawed, medical theories. Now, prepare yourself, because we're about to wade into the choppy waters where the warm, inviting steam of the bathhouse met the often chilling scrutiny of the church and its ever-present concern with morality. This was a constant battle, a tug-of-war between the undeniable human need for cleanliness and recreation, and the powerful religious institutions that viewed public bathing with deep, enduring suspicion. Imagine a medieval preacher standing in the pulpit, his voice echoing through the nave of a dimly lit church. He rails against the stews, not as places of hygiene, but as dens of iniquity, temptation, and moral decay. For many devout Christians, especially those influenced by ascetic ideals that emphasized spiritual purity through bodily denial, the very act of public bathing was fraught with peril. It represented worldly indulgence, a focus on the flesh rather than the spirit, and a dangerous opportunity for sin. The primary concern, as you might recall from our discussion on gender, was the potential for immorality arising from mixed bathing, or even perceived indecency in segregated facilities. If men and women were bathing in close proximity, even if not explicitly co-ed, the mere possibility of illicit glances, suggestive conversations, or worse, was enough to send shivers down the spine of a pious clergyman. The baths were often grouped with taverns and brothels in the minds of moralists, seen as places where societal norms broke down and temptation flourished. A quirky tidbit: some medieval allegories even depicted the devil lurking in bathhouses, tempting bathers to abandon their virtue. Talk about a steamy inferno. Beyond sexual immorality, the church also worried about vanity and excessive pleasure. The idea of soaking in warm water, perhaps with perfumes and oils, simply for comfort and enjoyment, could be seen as a form of self-indulgence that distracted from spiritual devotion. Why spend time pampering the body when you could be praying, fasting, or contemplating your soul? This ascetic viewpoint, though not universally applied, cast a long shadow over the public bathhouse, making it a target for criticism and attempts at suppression. So, how did the church try to exert its influence? It wasn't always a direct ban, at least not initially. Often, it took the form of moral condemnations from the pulpit, encouraging parishioners to avoid such places or to demand stricter segregation. Bishops and local clergy would issue pronouncements, warning against the dangers of the baths. It might pressure civic authorities to enact regulations. It was a war of words, a battle for the hearts and minds and bodies of the faithful. In some cases, specific religious orders or movements might have actively shunned public baths, promoting alternative forms of cleansing or emphasizing simple personal hygiene within a monastic setting. Remember our monks from earlier. Their emphasis on cleanliness was often about practical necessity and spiritual discipline, not about sensual pleasure. The tension between the church and the bathhouses varied significantly across regions and over time. In some areas, particularly where civic authorities were strong and the demand for baths was high, a compromise might be reached. Stricter rules on segregation, earlier closing times, or increased surveillance. In other, more religiously conservative areas, bathhouses might struggle to survive or be forced to operate in a more clandestine manner. Historians still argue whether the church's opposition to public bathing was a major cause of their eventual decline or merely a reflection of broader societal anxieties about public spaces. It's a complex chicken and egg scenario, isn't it? Did the church kill the baths, or did it just give them a bad reputation as they were already weakening? One of the most concrete impacts of this moral scrutiny was the push for stricter regulation, which we'll delve into more deeply next. But suffice it to say, the church's voice was a powerful one in medieval society, and its moral concerns often translated into attempts to control, restrict, or even shut down establishments perceived as undermining Christian values. This constant pressure meant that bathhouse owners and patrons often had to navigate a delicate balance between providing a desired service and avoiding the wrath of ecclesiastical authority. It's ironic, isn't it? The Romans, with their multiple gods and varied moral codes, embraced public bathing as a pillar of civilization. But with the rise of a singular, powerful Christian church, a place designed for basic human cleanliness became a focal point for moral anxiety. This isn't to say that all public bathhouses were indeed dens of vice, but the perception was often powerful enough to shape their destiny. So, while you might be imagining a relaxing, steamy soak, remember that for many, stepping into a medieval public bathhouse came with a side of moral judgment, and perhaps a whisper of temptation. You've just felt the simmering tension between the warm steam of the bathhouse and the fiery rhetoric of the church. Now, let's move from moral pronouncements to concrete action. Because as public bathhouses grew in popularity and sometimes notoriety, civic authorities stepped in to impose regulation and control. This wasn't just about moral policing. It was also about public order, health, and maintaining a semblance of decency in increasingly crowded medieval towns. Imagine the local town council, a group of burghers, guildmasters, and perhaps a representative of the Lord, meeting in the town hall. They've heard the complaints, seen the potential for mischief, and recognized the need to bring some order to the burgeoning bathhouse scene. Their concerns were multifaceted: managing public health, preventing crime, controlling prostitution, and ensuring general good conduct. It was their job to keep the peace in the streets, well, as clean as possible for the time. One of the most immediate and common forms of regulation was the imposition of specific hours of operation. Bathhouses might be forced to close at dusk, preventing nocturnal activities that were harder to monitor and more likely to involve illicit behavior. Imagine the bathhouse owner, perhaps begrudgingly, ushering out his last customers as the curfew bells chime. Right, out you go. No more soaking after sunset, orders from the council. Then there was the perennial issue of gender segregation. While the church might have preached against mixed bathing, civic authorities often codified this into law. Ordinances would be passed mandating separate times for men and women, or even distinct bathing areas. Inspections might be carried out, perhaps by town watchmen or designated officials, to ensure compliance. The goal was to remove the opportunity for impropriety, even if human nature often found a way around the rules. A quirky tidbit: some city ordinances even specified the maximum number of people allowed in a single tub, presumably to prevent overcrowding and, perhaps, overly intimate encounters. Talk about micromanagement. Licensing was another powerful tool. Bathhouse owners might be required to obtain a license from the town council, which could be revoked if they failed to adhere to regulations. This gave authorities a direct lever of control. It also provided another source of revenue for the town, a classic win-win for the municipality. You want to run a bathhouse? Fine, but you'll pay your fee and you'll follow our rules. Regulations also touched upon hygiene and maintenance. While medieval understanding of germs was non-existent, civic leaders certainly understood that stagnant water or filthy conditions were undesirable. Ordinances might stipulate how often water needed to be changed, how often tubs should be cleaned, and how waste should be disposed of. This was a pragmatic approach to public health, even if based on empirical observation rather than scientific theory. Historians still argue whether medieval regulations regarding bathhouses were primarily effective in controlling public health or mainly served as a means of moral and social control. It was likely a bit of both, often intertwined. Like a particularly knotty towel, fines and punishments were the stick to the licensing carrot. Owners or patrons caught violating regulations could face monetary penalties, and repeated offences might lead to the closure of the establishment. For more serious infractions, particularly those related to prostitution, the penalties could be severe, including public shaming or even imprisonment. This was a clear message that the town was serious about maintaining public order. The presence of bathhouses, like taverns, could sometimes lead to other public nuisances, noise complaints, quarrels, or even public drunkenness if drinks were served might fall under the purview of town regulations. The bathhouse, while a place of relaxation, was still a public space, and its activities were subject to the same oversight as any other part of urban life. It's fascinating to see how the very popularity of these places necessitated their regulation. What started as a simple response to a need for cleanliness evolved into a complex interplay of social custom, economic venture, moral anxiety, and civic control. The medieval public bathhouse was never truly freewheeling. It always operated within a framework of rules, whether those rules were enforced by custom, by clergy, or by civic decree. This constant push and pull between freedom and control is a timeless human story, and it played out dramatically in the steamy confines of these establishments. You've just seen how medieval towns tried to keep their bathhouses in line with various regulations, but now prepare for a historical curveball, a truly devastating event that would dramatically reshape not just public life, but the very perception of hygiene and communal gathering. We're about to enter the shadow of the Black Death, a catastrophe that didn't just decimate populations, but profoundly altered the course of public health practices, including the fate of those beloved bathhouses. Imagine the bustling, vibrant, medieval town you've come to know, with its markets, its guilds, and its steaming public baths. Suddenly, a new, terrifying sickness begins to spread. It's unlike anything anyone has ever seen. Swollen glands, fever, agonizing pain, and then swift death. The plague, carried by fleas on rats, but utterly mysterious in its true cause too. The people of the time sweeps across Europe with horrifying speed and ferocity. You can almost feel the chill of fear gripping the streets, the growing silence in once lively areas, the immediate impact on public gathering spaces, including bathhouses, was catastrophic. As the death toll mounted, fear became the dominant emotion. People desperately sought to avoid contact with the sick and with each other. Places where large groups congregated, once seen as hubs of community, were now viewed with extreme suspicion as potential vectors of the dreaded disease. The very warmth and closeness that made bathhouses appealing now made them terrifying. Think about it, a room full of naked or semi-naked people sharing water, breathing in humid air in close quarters. To the medieval mind, grappling with an invisible killer, this would have seemed like a perfect recipe for contagion, even if they didn't understand the exact mechanisms. While they didn't know about bacteria or viruses, they did observe that the plague spread rapidly in crowded environments. The logical, though ultimately incorrect in terms of the actual transmission vector conclusion, was that these gatherings, and the water itself, were dangerous. So, one of the most significant impacts of the Black Death was the rapid and widespread abandonment of public baths. People simply stopped going. Why risk contracting the deadly illness for a soak? Many bathhouses would have seen their clientele vanish overnight, Imagine the bathhouse owner watching nervously as days turn into weeks, and his one establishment sits empty, the fires extinguished, the tubs cold. The economic engine we discussed earlier ground to a terrifying halt. Beyond abandonment, some cities actively closed down their public baths as a public health measure, often among the first places to be shut. Civic authorities, desperate to stem the tide of death, would implement quarantines, ban public gatherings, and close down any establishment perceived as contributing to the spread of the plague. The bathhouses, with their communal nature, were easy targets for such decrees. This wasn't just about moral anxiety anymore. It was about sheer, desperate survival. The philosophical and medical understanding of water also underwent a dramatic shift. While earlier medieval medicine and Roman practice often viewed water as therapeutic and cleansing, the plague years fostered a deep-seated fear of water. It was believed that hot water opened the pores, allowing the bad air or miasma of the plague to enter the body more easily. This was a complete reversal of previous medical advice. Suddenly, getting too clean or soaking in water was seen as a risk, not a benefit. This fear led to a preference for dry cleaning methods. People turned to rubbing down with linen cloths, using strong perfumes and aromatic herbs to mask odors, and they hoped to ward off the noxious air thought to carry the plague. Cleanliness became about avoiding water, not embracing it. Imagine the stark contrast to the Roman love affair with immersion. Now, touching water felt like tempting fate. Historians still argue whether the Black Death's impact on public bathing was primarily due to a rationale given the lack of germ theory, fear of contagion, or if it merely accelerated a decline already underway due to moral and economic pressures. It was likely an enormous, devastating push that solidified anxieties already present. The plague didn't create the moral opposition, but it certainly gave it a terrifying new justification. A quirky tidbit: some plague doctors, often wearing their bird-like masks filled with aromatic herbs, might have even advised against washing, believing that the protective layer of dirt on the skin helped seal off the pores. While this sounds utterly repugnant to our modern sensibilities, in their desperate world, it made a twisted kind of sense based on their miasma theory of disease. So, in a strange historical twist, being visibly dirty might have been perceived as a protective measure during the plague. The Black Death was a true turning point. It wasn't just a temporary closure. It initiated a long-term, fundamental shift in European hygiene practices. The widespread, accessible public bathhouse, which had seen a resurgence in the High Middle Ages, simply could not recover from such a profound and terrifying blow to its reputation and perceived safety. The fear instilled by the plague would linger for generations, making people wary of communal spaces and, crucially, wary of water itself. The steamy, social hubs of yesteryear were about to become a distant, almost forgotten memory. You've just witnessed the terrifying shadow of the Black Death fall over Europe, causing the swift and dramatic abandonment of public bathhouses. Now, let's delve deeper into the long-term psychological and practical aftermath of this catastrophe. Because the fear wasn't just temporary. It morphed into a pervasive post-plague panic, a deep-seated suspicion of water, especially shared water, that would linger for centuries and fundamentally reshape European hygiene. Imagine a generation, and then another, growing up in the shadow of the plague. Memories of the swift, agonizing deaths are vivid, passed down through families. The prevailing medical theory, the miasma theory, still holds sway. Disease is caused by bad air or noxious fumes. And as we discussed, hot water was tragically linked to this theory, believed to open the pores and invite the deadly miasma into the body. This wasn't just a fleeting superstition, it became a core belief that profoundly influenced daily habits. So, the once popular idea of a warm, communal soak was now viewed with extreme apprehension. Why would you deliberately open your pores to the very air that might carry death? The logical conclusion, if your understanding of disease was based on miasma, was to keep your pores closed. And how do you do that? By avoiding hot water and by maintaining a protective barrier on your skin. This led to a significant shift from the Roman and high medieval emphasis on full body immersion. Instead of bathing, people increasingly turned to superficial cleansing. This often involved rubbing down with dry cloths, or with cloths dampened with vinegar or perfumed alcohol, which were believed to purify the air and perhaps offer some antiseptic qualities, though again, without understanding why. Think of it as a medieval dry shampoo routine for your whole body. Strong perfumes and fragrant herbs became immensely popular, not just for aesthetic appeal, but as a perceived defense against the bad air of disease. You'd carry pomanders, little balls of sweet-smelling substances, or scatter fragrant rushes on your floors. It was less about cleanliness and more about masking odors and trying to ward off invisible threats. The lingering fear of contagion extended beyond just the water. Any communal gathering space, particularly those that involved close physical proximity, became suspect. The very social aspect that had made bathhouses so appealing in the High Middle Ages now made them terrifying. Who knew what hidden illness lay on the next person's skin, or lingered in the shared air? This shift contributed to a more insular approach to personal hygiene, moving it firmly into the private sphere of the home, away from public view and perceived risk. This post-plague shift wasn't uniform across all of Europe, nor was it absolute. Some regions, particularly those with strong existing traditions or where the plague's impact was less severe, might have maintained a few bathhouses or seen their eventual limited return. However, the general trend, particularly in Western Europe, was a steep and lasting decline. The grand Roman legacy of public bathing was effectively buried by the fear of the plague. Historians still argue whether the decline of public baths post-plague was a direct result of the plague itself, or if other socio-economic factors were equally or more significant. It's probably a case of the plague being the straw that broke the camel's back, accelerating a trend towards privatization that was already gaining traction. A quirky tidbit: some aristocratic households might have employed sweaters, individuals whose job was to induce sweating in their masters through various means: hot blankets, specialized chairs, as a way of purifying the body without immersion in water. It was a kind of dry detoxification, a reflection of the intense fear of waterborne disease, even if misguided. Imagine being paid to make someone else sweat. The long-term consequence of this post-plague panic was a distinct change in the European approach to hygiene that would last for centuries. The emphasis shifted from internal cleansing and opening pores to external appearance and the masking of odors. Clean linen, frequently changed, became the primary marker of cleanliness for the wealthy, as it could be laundered separately and vigorously without the perceived risks of full-body bathing. If you couldn't get a good soak, at least you could put on clean clothes and smell vaguely of lavender. This fear of water would contribute to the misconception, which persisted for centuries, that medieval and later early modern Europeans were universally dirty. While it's true that full-body bathing became far less frequent for many, it wasn't an abandonment of hygiene entirely, but rather a drastic revaluation of its methods based on a catastrophic, poorly understood disease. The fear of contagion, however misplaced its focus on water, was real and profound. And so, the vibrant, steaming hubs of the High Middle Ages became ghostly memories, replaced by a deep-seated suspicion of the very element that once promised cleansing and community. You've just felt the lingering chill of post-plague panic, and its profound impact on bathing habits, transforming a love for water into a deep suspicion. But as the medieval period begins to wane and the intellectual fervor of the Renaissance sweeps across Europe, something new starts to stir. This wasn't a sudden return to Roman bathing grandeur. but rather a slow, subtle reassessment of ideas on cleanliness, influenced by a renewed interest in classical learning and a changing philosophical landscape. Imagine yourself in a vibrant Italian city-state, Florence or Venice perhaps, brimming with new art, new ideas, and a rediscovery of ancient texts. Humanists are poring over Greek and Roman manuscripts, and among these rediscovered works are treatises on health, medicine, and hygiene. These texts, celebrating the Roman emphasis on physical well-being and the careful balance of the body, began to subtly challenge the prevailing post-plague fear of water. It wasn't an overnight revelation, but a gradual chipping away at centuries of ingrained apprehension. The Renaissance, emphasis on the human body as a work of art and a vessel for intellectual pursuit, naturally led to a renewed, if cautious, interest in its care. While the ascetic rejection of the body had been a strong theme in some medieval Christian thought, the Renaissance embraced a more holistic view of humanity, where physical health and beauty were seen as complementary to intellectual and spiritual development. You can almost hear the Renaissance scholars, perhaps in a quiet study, musing over ancient texts that spoke of baths as places of health and vitality, a stark contrast to the warnings of their own grandmothers. This didn't immediately translate into a widespread return of public bathhouses as they were known in the High Middle Ages. The psychological scars of the plague were deep, and the logistical challenges of water supply and heating remained. However, there was a growing intellectual appreciation for the principles of Roman hygiene, even if their practical implementation remained limited. Discussions shifted from condemning public baths outright to considering them potentially beneficial if managed correctly and with appropriate caution. One subtle but significant change was in the understanding of medical theory. While germ theory was still centuries away, the Renaissance saw a greater emphasis on empirical observation and a gradual move away from purely humoral explanations. Physicians began to note the practical benefits of cleanliness, even if they couldn't explain why it worked. This wasn't a scientific revolution in hygiene, but a nascent intellectual curiosity that laid groundwork for future discoveries. Historians still argue whether Renaissance medical thinking truly challenged existing hygiene practices or merely provided new justifications for existing social customs. It's a bit like putting new wine in old bottles. The content might be different, but the container looks familiar. The personal hygiene practices of the wealthy began to reflect some of these shifting attitudes. While private tubs remained the norm, there might have been a subtle increase in their frequency of use, or a greater emphasis on personal cleanliness as a sign of sophistication and good breeding. Cleanliness became not just about avoiding disease or inviting it, according to post-plague theory, but also about presenting a refined and cultured image. If you were a Renaissance noble, you might still avoid public baths, but you'd certainly want to look and smell the part of a discerning patron of the arts. A quirky tidbit: some Renaissance treatises on manners and deportment included sections on personal hygiene, recommending regular washing of hands and face, and often suggesting the use of scented waters and powders, even if full-body baths were still infrequent. It was about creating an illusion of cleanliness through external polish. The interest in classical architecture and engineering also meant that scholars and architects studied the ruins of Roman baths with renewed fascination. They marveled at the aqueducts and heating systems, perhaps not fully understanding their construction, but certainly appreciating their ingenuity. This intellectual curiosity, though not leading to immediate reconstruction of such facilities, kept the idea of sophisticated communal bathing alive in the collective consciousness. It was a recognition of a lost skill, a past glory, however. Despite this intellectual reassessment, the practical realities and the lingering fear of contagion meant that the public bathhouse, as a widespread urban institution, did not make a grand comeback during the Renaissance. The focus remained largely on private hygiene for the elite, and more superficial cleansing for the masses. The seeds of new ideas were planted, but they would take centuries to truly blossom into a widespread return to regular, full-body immersion. The Renaissance, while revolutionary in many ways, was more about intellectual shifts than immediate, widespread practical changes in public hygiene. It was a whisper of change, not a roar. You've just witnessed the subtle, intellectual stirrings of the Renaissance, hinting at a new appreciation for classical ideas of hygiene. But now, let's confront the harsh reality. Despite these intellectual shifts and even scattered attempts at revival, the grand story of the medieval European public bathhouse largely culminates in a prolonged decline and eventual disappearance. In many parts of the continent, the vibrant communal hubs of the High Middle Ages faded, leaving behind only scattered remnants and a legacy that was largely misunderstood for centuries. Imagine the last remaining public bathhouse in a once town. The regular clientele has dwindled, replaced by only the most desperate or the most morally questionable. The fires are less frequently stoked, the tubs are often cold, and the general atmosphere has shifted from bustling community hub to quiet, almost eerie desolation. The economic viability, once robust, has evaporated. The owner struggles to keep the doors open, battling against declining demand and persistent societal suspicion. Several factors contributed to this final, decisive decline. First and foremost, as we explored, was the lingering psychological trauma and misguided medical theories associated with the Black Death. The pervasive fear that hot water opened pores to disease was a powerful deterrent. This wasn't something that faded quickly. It was ingrained in the collective consciousness for generations. Why would you pay money to risk your life for a soak when a simple wipe down felt safer? Secondly, the moral opposition from the church continued to be a significant factor. Even if official bans weren't always in place, the constant condemnation from the pulpit and the association of public baths with immorality, especially prostitution, which many stews did indeed become associated with, eroded their social standing. Who wanted to be seen frequenting a place that was constantly being denounced as a den of sin? Respectable citizens, even if they craved cleanliness, might choose to avoid such establishments to protect their reputation. Economically, maintaining public bathhouses remained a significant challenge. The cost of heating large quantities of water was substantial, especially as wood resources might become scarcer in some urban areas over time. Without consistent patronage, the revenue simply couldn't cover the overhead. Many owners would have simply closed their doors, finding more profitable ventures or retiring from a failing business. The bathhouse was often a private enterprise, and when it ceased to be profitable, it ceased to exist. Technological stagnation in plumbing also played a role. While the Romans had marvels of water engineering, medieval Europe largely lost or simply did not widely adopt those sophisticated techniques. Water distribution within towns remained rudimentary for centuries, often relying on public wells or laborious manual transport. This made the logistics of large-scale public bathing inherently inefficient and expensive, further hindering any attempts at widespread revival. You might have seen the ruins of Roman aqueducts, but you certainly weren't building new ones on the same scale as the early modern period approached. Private hygiene continued to evolve, albeit slowly, within the domestic sphere. For the wealthy, this meant more frequent use of private tubs, still filled manually, basins for washing, and a greater emphasis on clean linen and perfumed clothing. For the less affluent, it meant more frequent changes of outer garments, if they could afford them, and continued reliance on superficial washing. The idea was to keep one's outer appearance clean and to smell pleasant, even if a full immersion bath was rare. It became about projecting an image of cleanliness, rather than necessarily achieving it through widespread public facilities. Historians still argue whether the decline of public baths was a symptom of a general decline in hygiene standards or simply a shift from communal to private forms of cleansing. It was likely a complex change, where the public, accessible aspect of communal washing largely vanished, but the desire for cleanliness, however it was achieved, persisted in different forms. By the 16th and 17th centuries. The public bathhouse, as a common urban fixture in much of Western Europe, was largely a thing of the past. Its memory lingered, sometimes in place named Stew's Lane, but its active function had withered away. If you wanted a full body wash, you typically did it at home, in a portable tub, with water you heated yourself. This left a void that would be filled by other means of achieving perceived cleanliness, and it cemented the popular, though, as we'll see, often inaccurate image of a largely unwashed, medieval and early modern European populace. The steam had dissipated, the social hub had emptied, and a quiet, domestic approach to cleanliness settled in for a long stay. You've just watched the medieval public bathhouse largely vanish from the European landscape, a casualty of plague, moral anxieties, and practical challenges. So, if the steamy communal spaces were gone, how did people in the later medieval and early modern periods maintain any semblance of cleanliness? Well, they developed and relied heavily on alternative hygiene methods, often focused on superficial cleansing, masking odors, and the clever use of fabrics. It was less about immersion and more about illusion, a testament to human adaptability in the face of perceived health risks and technological limitations. Imagine a wealthy lady in her chambers in the 15th or 16th century. You won't find a grand, built-in bath like those in Roman villas. Instead, her morning routine would likely involve a small basin of cold water, perhaps scented with rosewater or orange blossom. With a fine linen cloth, she would wash her hands, face, and perhaps other exposed parts of her body. It was a quick freshen up, designed to remove visible dirt and leave a pleasant scent. This was the daily norm for the privileged. For the less affluent, the same principle applied, but with simpler means. A bucket of water from the well, a coarser cloth, and perhaps a bit of plain lye soap if available. The focus was on practical spot cleaning rather than full immersion. You'd prioritize areas that got particularly dirty or smelly: hands, face, armpits, and feet. It was efficient, minimal, and, crucially, avoided the perceived dangers of a full hot bath. The true hero of post-plague hygiene, especially for the wealthy, was linen. Fine linen undergarments, worn directly against the skin, were seen as porous and absorbent, capable of wicking away sweat and grime from the body. The practice was to change these linen shirts and shifts frequently, perhaps daily for the very rich, or every few days for those of more modest means. The argument was that the linen absorbed the impurities from the skin, and then it could be vigorously washed and bleached, taking the dirt and the perceived miasma away from the body. It was an indirect form of cleaning, where the garment acted as a sanitary barrier. You could almost hear them saying, "Why wash the body when the linen can do all the hard work?" This reliance on clean linen also meant that laundry became an incredibly important and labor-intensive aspect of household management. Imagine the endless scrubbing, beating, and boiling of linen garments, particularly for large aristocratic households. It was a continuous cycle of cleanliness, focused on textiles rather than directly on the body itself. This meticulous care for linen was a visible sign of status and cleanliness. A quirky tidbit: some wealthy individuals were said to own hundreds of linen shirts, changing them multiple times a day to maintain a pristine, fresh appearance. Talk about a laundry pile. Then there were perfumes, powders, and aromatic waters. With full body bathing becoming less frequent, masking body odors became paramount. Fine perfumes, often imported from the East, were incredibly expensive and a clear status symbol. People would apply scented powders to their skin, use fragrant pomanders, little balls of scented material carried on the person, and and spray aromatic waters on their clothes and hair. This wasn't about deep cleansing. It was about creating a pleasant olfactory illusion. You might not be clean, but you'd certainly smell clean, or at least less offensive. For the hair, dry shampoos or powders were used, often scented with herbs. Brushing and combing were regular practices to remove tangles and loose dirt. For oral hygiene, chewing on herbs, rinsing with scented waters, or using abrasive powders like ground bone or chalk were common. It was a holistic approach to presenting a clean image, even if the underlying methods were quite different from what we consider hygienic today. The understanding of cleanliness was also subtly shifting from an internal purity, as in the Roman humoral theory, to an external presentation. It was less about opening pores to release humors, and more about appearing respectable and avoiding offending others with unpleasant odors or visible dirt. This was particularly important in social interactions, where a fresh appearance, even if achieved superficially, was valued. Historians still argue whether these alternative hygiene methods genuinely maintained a reasonable level of cleanliness, or simply perpetuated a myth of cleanliness through appearance. It's a complex dance between perception and reality, isn't it? So, while the grand communal bathhouses receded into memory, the human desire for cleanliness, or at least the appearance of it, persisted. People adapted, devising ingenious, if sometimes peculiar methods to stay fresh in a world that often lacked easy access to abundant, heated water. These alternative hygiene practices highlight a period of significant change, demonstrating how societies creatively respond to challenges, even if those responses are sometimes based on a misunderstanding of the true nature of health and disease. And this enduring legacy of dry cleaning and perfume would shape perceptions of hygiene for centuries to come, leading to some persistent myths about medieval squalor. You've just explored the ingenious, if somewhat superficial, alternative hygiene methods that emerged after the decline of public bathhouses. Now, it's time to confront a truly persistent piece of historical baggage: the widespread misconception of medieval European squalor. For centuries, popular culture, and even some academic narratives, have painted the Middle Ages as a universally dirty, unwashed, and disease-ridden era. But as you've seen, the truth about medieval hygiene is far more nuanced, and often much cleaner than the stereotype suggests. Imagine flipping through a history textbook or watching a movie set in the Middle Ages. What do you often see? Grimy peasants, knights in rusty armor with questionable personal aromas, and cities perpetually knee-deep in muck. This image is deeply ingrained, and it often stems from a combination of selective historical interpretation, Victorian era moralizing, and a misunderstanding of what cleanliness meant in different historical contexts. The first point to debunk is the idea that no one bathed. As we've thoroughly explored before the Black Death, public bathhouses were a vibrant reality in many European towns, offering regular opportunities for communal cleansing. The Romans, of course, were obsessed with bathing, and even after the plague, while public baths declined, private washing and meticulous care of linen continued, especially for the elite. People did wash, they just didn't always do it in the same ways or as frequently as we do today, and certainly not with our endless supply of hot, running water. The myth of universal medieval filth often arises from a comparison to modern, 21st century hygiene standards. We have instant hot water, soap that actually lathers, and germ theory that tells us why we should wash. Measuring medieval people by these benchmarks is like judging a horse-drawn carriage by the speed of a sports car. It's anachronistic and unfair. Medieval people had different tools, different scientific understanding, and different cultural priorities. Historians still argue whether the widespread belief in medieval squalor is primarily a result of a misreading of historical sources or a lingering effect of later cultural biases. It's probably a bit of both, a persistent smudge on the historical lens. Consider the role of social class. As we saw, a lord had access to private tubs and clean linen, something far beyond the reach of a peasant. A peasant, working in the fields all day, would certainly be dirty from labor. But would they never wash? Of course not. They'd use streams, rivers, or basins of cold water. Their cleanliness was functional to remove the dust of the day, to feel refreshed rather than a luxury. To lump everyone into one dirty category ignores the vast differences in living conditions and access to resources. The medieval understanding of disease, based on miasma theory, led to practices that seemed dirty to us, but were considered rational. At the time, the fear of bad air entering through open pores, hence the aversion to hot baths post-plague, might have discouraged full immersion, but it led to a heightened focus on masking odors with perfumes and changing linen frequently. This was their best attempt at hygiene given their knowledge. A quirky tidbit: medieval laundresses were highly skilled, using strong lye soaps, boiling water, and intense beating to get linen dazzlingly white, demonstrating a real commitment to clean clothing, if not always clean bodies. Furthermore, medieval towns, while certainly odorous by modern standards due to open sewers and animal waste, were not entirely devoid of sanitation efforts. Remember the monastic latrines and early urban attempts at waste management, however imperfect. People understood the unpleasantness and potential ill effects of garbage. Charters and ordinances from various towns show repeated attempts to regulate waste disposal and keep streets clear of refuse, even if enforcement was often a challenge. It was a constant struggle, not an inherent disregard for cleanliness. The portrayal of medieval people as dirty often serves to highlight later periods, like the Enlightenment or Victorian era, as more enlightened or clean. It creates a convenient historical narrative of progress that sometimes sacrifices accuracy for simplicity. The reality is that human beings have always sought to keep themselves and their environments clean to the best of their abilities, given their circumstances. So, when you think of medieval Europe, challenge that ingrained image of universal squalor. Picture instead a dynamic, evolving landscape of hygiene, sometimes communal and luxurious pre-plague, sometimes private and pragmatic, sometimes driven by fear, and sometimes by a simple desire for comfort. Medieval people were not inherently dirtier than their Roman predecessors, or even some of their early modern successors. They simply had different practices and priorities shaped by unique historical circumstances. The myth of medieval dirt, like a stubborn stain, is hard to remove, but hopefully, you now have a clearer, cleaner picture. You've just helped me scrub away the stubborn myth of universal medieval squalor, revealing a more nuanced history of hygiene. Now, let's fast forward, because the story of communal bathing in Europe didn't end with the medieval decline. It merely went into a very long hibernation, only to experience fascinating modern echoes and a remarkable resurfacing of bathing traditions that in some ways harkened back to the communal spirit of both Roman thermae and medieval stews. Imagine yourself in a contemporary city, perhaps Budapest with its grand thermal baths, or a bustling hammam in Istanbul, a sauna in Scandinavia, or a modern-day Korean gilbang. What do these places share? A focus on communal warmth, relaxation, and a shared experience of cleansing. While the historical lineage might not be direct or unbroken from medieval Europe, the spirit of communal bathing, that innate human desire to gather and cleanse together, has found new life in various forms around the world, and indeed, back in Europe. Take the Turkish hammam, for instance. While its origins lie in the Roman and Byzantine bath traditions, and were significantly influenced by Islamic culture, it shares a striking resemblance in its social function to the early medieval public baths. The hammam is not just about washing. It's a place for gossip, business, relaxation, and community building. You move through rooms of varying temperatures, get scrubbed down, and emerge feeling completely refreshed. It's a testament to the enduring appeal of communal steam and human connection. And while not exactly a direct descendant of medieval European baths, it shows how the concept of the public bath persisted and thrived in other cultures, influencing a later resurgence in Europe. Then there are the grand thermal baths of Central Europe, particularly in Hungary, Austria, and Germany. Many of these are built over natural hot springs, used for centuries, even millennia, for their therapeutic properties, while some of their heyday was in the 19th and early 20th centuries. They represent a continuity of the idea that water, especially naturally warm or mineral-rich water, is beneficial for health and well-being. You can see families, friends, and individuals all enjoying the same vast pools, chatting, playing, and simply soaking in the communal warmth. It's a far cry from the post-plague fear of water in the Nordic countries. The sauna tradition is another powerful example of communal heat and cleansing. While typically dry heat rather than wet steam, the social aspect and the ritual of purification are strikingly similar to historical bathing practices. You sit together, sweat, perhaps engage in light conversation, and then brave a cold plunge. It's about physical and mental renewal, a shared experience that strengthens community bonds. A quirky tidbit: in some Scandinavian countries, it's not uncommon for business deals to be struck in the sauna, mirroring the informal business meetings that once took place in medieval baths. The resurgence of interest in these forms of communal bathing in modern Europe and globally speaks to a revaluation of our relationship with water, health, and social interaction. After centuries of a more private, often individualistic approach to hygiene, there's a renewed appreciation for the benefits of shared spaces for relaxation and well-being. We now understand germ theory, so the fear of shared water is largely mitigated by modern filtration and sanitation. This allows us to re-embrace the communal aspect without the historical anxieties. Modern spas and wellness centers, while often more luxurious and expensive than their medieval predecessors, also echo the multifaceted role of the historical bathhouse. You can get massages, engage in light exercise, relax, and socialize. They are places of holistic well-being, reflecting a contemporary understanding that physical and mental health are intertwined, much as medieval physicians, in their own way, viewed the body and humors. Historians still argue whether the modern resurgence of communal bathing is a conscious revival of historical practices or an independent evolution driven by contemporary wellness trends. It's likely a complex interplay, a subconscious tapping into an ancient human need. So, while the specific timber-framed stew of medieval Europe might not have made a direct comeback, its spirit lives on. The human desire for warmth, for cleanliness, for communal interaction in a relaxed setting is timeless. From the Roman thermae to the medieval bathhouses, and then across continents and centuries to the modern thermal spas and saunas, the story of communal bathing reminds us that our relationship with water and cleanliness is deeply intertwined with our social lives, our health, and our cultural values. The water may change, the buildings may evolve, but the fundamental human need for a good soak, shared with others, remains remarkably constant. You've journeyed through the rise and fall of medieval public bathhouses, witnessed their Roman grandeur and their post-plague decline, and even explored their fascinating modern echoes. Now, as our journey nears its end, let's take a moment to reflect on the enduring lessons from the lather, pondering what this curious case of medieval European public bathhouses tells us about human nature, society, and our ever-evolving relationship with water. Imagine stepping back, taking a wider view of the historical tapestry we've unfurled tonight. What strikes you most? Perhaps it's the sheer adaptability of human beings, from the simple river washes of ancient communities to the monumental Roman thermae, and then the more rustic medieval stews. The desire for cleanliness and comfort, in some form, has persisted through incredible changes. We find ways to adapt, to innovate, and to seek out that feeling of refreshment, even when faced with scarcity or fear. One of the most profound lessons is the intertwined nature of hygiene and society. The bathhouse was never just about getting clean. It was a microcosm of its era. In Roman times, it reflected imperial power, engineering prowess, and a vibrant public life. In the High Middle Ages, it mirrored the burgeoning urban centers, their entrepreneurial spirit, and the complexities of social interaction and moral control. When society fractured, so too did the public bath. When fear gripped populations, hygiene practices fundamentally altered. Our personal habits are rarely just personal. They are deeply shaped by the world around us. Then there's the constant tension between public health and moral concerns. The story of the medieval bathhouse is a fascinating case study in how religious doctrines and societal anxieties can clash with, and sometimes even override, practical health needs. The Church's opposition to perceived immorality in baths played a significant role in their decline, even as towns struggled with issues of sanitation. This ongoing debate about what constitutes public decency versus public benefit is a timeless one, and the medieval bathhouse stood right at its steamy center. Consider also the power of information, or the lack thereof. The Black Death's impact on bathing habits is a stark reminder of how devastating misinformation or a limited scientific understanding can be. The logical, but ultimately incorrect, conclusion that hot water opened pores to disease led to centuries of altered hygiene practices. It underscores the vital importance of scientific inquiry and understanding in shaping public health policies and individual choices. We take germ theory for granted now, but imagine living in a world where disease was an invisible, terrifying force, and you were constantly trying to guess its rules. The story also challenges us to reconsider our own preconceptions about the past. The persistent myth of medieval squalor often colors our understanding of the era. By diving into the reality of bathhouses, however varied and imperfect, we gain a richer, more nuanced appreciation for the ingenuity and efforts of people who lived centuries ago. They weren't just dirty, they were adapting to their world, just as we adapt to ours. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval texts describe bath attendants offering personalized services, including scrubbing with loofahs and even hair washing with special preparations, showing a surprising level of individual care within these communal settings. And finally, there's the enduring human appeal of water and warmth as sources of comfort and renewal. From the earliest river dips to today's luxurious spas, the feeling of immersion, of shedding the day's burdens in warm water, is deeply satisfying. It's a primal comfort, a universal desire that transcends cultural and historical boundaries. Even after centuries of decline, the communal bath eventually found new expressions, reminding us that some human needs and some forms of human connection are truly timeless. So, as you drift off tonight, perhaps you'll carry with you not just the image of a steaming medieval bathhouse, but a deeper understanding of the complex forces that shape our seemingly simple acts of cleanliness. You've witnessed how a basic human need can become a social institution, an economic driver, a moral battleground, and a victim of historical catastrophe. It's a story of ingenuity, fear, adaptation, and ultimately, a testament to the enduring human desire to feel, quite literally, refreshed.